Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. I'm supplanting the role of our program director and welcoming everyone for Grand Rounds today as he is on the plane. He's irreplaceable, but I will do my best. So we are very, very happy today and excited to have Dr. Sharon Strauss take time out of her very busy schedule to join us to teach us about mentorship. Dr. Strauss has many accolades, and I'm just going to review them with you first. She is the Executive Vice President and Clinical and Chief Medical Officer and the Director of the Knowledge Translation Program at Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute and the Chief Medical Officer at St. Michael's Hospital, as well as a professor in the Department of Medicine. She has authored more than 650 peer-reviewed publications and 3 textbooks in evidence-based medicine, knowledge translation, and mentorship. She is a highly cited clinical researcher in the top 1% and also holds more than $80 million in peer-reviewed research grants as PI. She has received national awards for mentorship, research, and education. She was awarded an honorary doctorate in medicine from the University of Montreal, is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and is a member of the Order of Canada. And today she's going to speak to us about evidence-based mentorship. So please give her a very warm welcome. And thank you so much, Dr. Strauss, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the opportunity to come and spend some time with you this morning, and especially around one of my favorite topics, which I call the other EBM. So I started off my career really focusing on evidence-based medicine, evidence-based practice, but intertwined with that became an interest that I developed in evidence-based mentorship. And so I'm gonna speak to that today. And it really focuses on, I always say to everybody, and that I honestly believe I have the best job in the world. And I'm sure everybody here would argue and say that they've got the best job, but I truly believe that I have the best job in the world. And I'm going to speak to why I think that's the case and why I feel privileged to do what I get to do. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge the land on which I feel privileged to be able to live and work. And in particular, being based in Toronto, as you all know, that this land is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas with a credit and the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And in particular, one of the things that I wanted to acknowledge is that when I do give talks like this, I also use it as an opportunity to act as well. And so in honor of the presentation today, I gave a donation to Anishinaabe Health. And if anybody has not yet had a chance to see their new building down on Cherry Street, I would encourage you to have a look and see that. It's an amazing building for amazing work that this group does. So I'm gonna speak about mentorship, and I do want to acknowledge that I did write a book on mentorship with Dave Sackett, who was my mentor, but I don't actually benefit from any of the royalties. They go to a fund for trainees, and I have no control over that. So just so that you're aware of that as a competing interest. So this is what we're going to talk about today. And so hopefully by the end, we'll have talked about mentorship, but also thinking about, if your department wants to set up a mentorship program, or in the future, when you set up your careers in the future, if you want to do something like that, I'm going to talk a little bit about that too, and about how we set it up in our department. So I don't know if this looks familiar to anybody, but this is actually where I met my mentor for the very first time. So I did my clinical training at U of T and started my graduate training in ClinEpi. And then, kind of as typical when you're a trainee, you get told to go away for a while, do something different, learn something different. And I didn't really know that I loved clinical research at that time. I had just started my graduate training. And so I thought, well, where do I want to go? Who do I want to learn from? And Dave Sackett was kind of one of the founders of clinical epidemiology, and he had just moved to Oxford to start up a new center. And I didn't know him, but I thought, well, I'll send him an email and see if he is taking on fellows. And so I emailed him and said, what my interests were, and was he accepting research fellows. And within about 5 or 10 minutes, he responded to my email and said, sure, come on over. And so I went, and thinking, well, I'll go for a year and see how it goes. And I ended up staying for 4 years. And this is where we met for the first time. So this is the Trout Pub, which is in Oxford. If anybody likes detective novels like by Colin Dexter, it's also called the Morse Pub. And Dave and his wife Barbara took me for dinner here, and he sat me down and he said, "What do you want to do in your career and your life?" And so I told him, and then he said, "Okay, I will do whatever I can to help you realize your dreams." And he said, "Whatever I can do, I will facilitate. And just tell me how that's going to work along the way." And my first response was I didn't believe him, because I'd never had that said to me before. And I don't know how many of you in the room or online have ever had that said to you, but it was my first experience of that. And I thought, how can he really mean that? And one of the things that I learned from Dave over the years was that he didn't just say it, he did it and he lived it. And the only thing that he ever asked in return was that I do the same for others. And again, that was a very powerful thing. It was a powerful thing to hear somebody say, "I want to do whatever I can to facilitate your dreams and your goals," and then not to ask anything in return other than that you do the same for others. And so that really was incredibly influential for me. But one of the things that I started to think about, well, what is mentorship, and why was he such an amazing mentor? And how can I, even get like a 1% of what he was, and how do you do that? And so I started, as a researcher, and those of us who are researchers tend to be kind of a little bit of a data geek and things. And so I felt I had to like learn about it and really understand what mentorship is. And so I started doing work to understand. And this was really one of the definitions that resonated with me. And in particular, wanting to highlight that the mentor fulfills a lot of different roles. It's about being that sponsor, that exemplar, providing the moral support, and assisting and facilitating the realization of the dream. The mentor should not be the person who's telling the mentee what to do, but should support the mentee in developing that vision and helping them achieve it. And so then I started doing some work in the area to really understand, well, is a mentor a role model, a coach, a sponsor, an ally? And ideally, a mentor should be all of these things. So a mentor should be a role model, but a role model isn't necessarily a mentor. So we can see a role model. So for example, when I attend on the inpatient units, I can see somebody else as an attending on the unit and think that's a great way to, to do team-based rounds, or, to interact with the learners. And I can use that person as a role model, but it's often that passive observational learning model. And so a mentor should be a good role model, but a role model isn't necessarily a mentor. Similarly, a mentor can be a coach, but a coach isn't necessarily a mentor. So for example, in our Department of Medicine, when somebody goes through the promotion process, we assign them a coach to help them through that. So it's a very task-based, specific achievement that we're focused on. And it's not kind of this holistic approach to personal and career development that a mentor should provide. And similarly, that a mentor should be an excellent sponsor. So ideally, you want mentors who are going to be able to provide you with opportunities, networking, introductions to colleagues, and to provide collaborations. And a mentor should also be an ally, somebody who is aligned and is going to be an advocate. So then, not surprisingly, being a data geek, I thought, well, I better look at the literature and see what do we know about mentorship. And so we did some systematic reviews on the topic, including both the quantitative and the qualitative literature, and have updated it over the years. And one of the things I want to highlight right off the top is that there are no randomized trials of mentorship. So we don't have any studies where, we randomize, one person to get mentored and the other person not to get mentored. And I don't know that we'll ever see a study like that. We do have some studies where they randomize different types of education for mentorship, but not presence or absence of mentorship. And so if you look at the data altogether, what does it tell us? So academics who got mentored were more satisfied in their careers. So they were happier in their careers, they were happier in what they were doing. And they also received more research grants. They had more protected time for scholarly activities. They produced more publications. And these are some of the data that I used when we were getting a mentorship program set up within a research institute, because obviously within a research institute, it's always good to count grants and publications. And so if you're mentored, you're more likely to get grants and publications. Not surprisingly, then, people who were mentored were then promoted more quickly. People who were mentored were also more likely to stay at their academic institutions. And this is something I think is really critically important. We want people to be happy in what they're doing, fulfilled in what they're doing, excited and passionate about what they're doing, and to stay at the academic institutions. We want to make sure that people, that people have great careers and that they feel supported within their institutions. And mentorship can do that. They can also facilitate diversity in recruitment. And the other thing that sometimes we forget about, because a lot of times when we're developing mentorship programs, we think about the impact on mentees. We don't think about the impact on mentors. And in particular, I wanted to highlight that it benefits mentors as well. It keeps us stimulated, interested in our jobs as well when we're mentors. I always say that, interacting with mentees is one of the best parts of my job, because, it always leads to, they push me to think differently a lot of times. And sometimes it opens up new areas of research that we end up doing together. Like it's incredible how impactful it is on the mentors as well. And in particular, it helps address wellness and burnout. And, there's a lot in the literature now about, physician wellness and burnout. And mentorship has been shown to help with the mentee and mentor wellness and burnout. It provides that sense of connection, that sense of support, that collegiality. And so it can have an impact on wellness and burnout. We also have to be mindful of the time commitment for mentors. And this is one of the topics that comes up sometimes, is how many mentees can a mentor take on? And really, to be a good mentor, you want to make sure that you can provide the time for the mentees. I wanted just to spend a little bit of time talking about using an equity lens in this work as well. And this has really accelerated over the last few years. And I wanted to speak to in particular since COVID. And because there's been more literature coming out since then about the impact on BIPOC academics, and in particular from a clinical perspective, a research perspective, from a personal perspective. And when for developing mentorship programs, we should be thinking about this, because we want to make sure that we address the needs of everybody in our departments and our training programs. And are we considering people's unique needs, the career stage that they're at, what career setbacks they might have had as a result of things such as the experiences during COVID? And how can we then support acceleration of career development for these individuals, so that they're not facing, a continuous uphill battle? Just to show some examples, I don't know if people have seen any of this work by Vincent Lariviere. He's based in Quebec, and he's done a lot of work on bibliometrics and showing kind of what happens with publications over time and things. And he's done a lot of really interesting work. But during COVID and since COVID, he really looked at, who was publishing, who were submitting grants, and who was publishing. And in particular, finding that women were submitting and registering fewer studies. And then also looking at who is then publishing. And these are the medRxiv and databases, as you know, for publishing open access studies and before they undergo peer review. And one of the things to highlight is the gap, the gender gap. And he's subsequently done this now over the last 5 years, and shown that it's not actually reduced, it actually continues to grow. So I think that this is one of the things when we think about from a mentorship perspective, is thinking about who are the individuals maybe who aren't getting mentored, and that we need to make sure that they get mentored. One of the things I wanted to highlight as well is the importance of mentorship on getting, people excited in their careers. And I don't know if anybody has been following this series and this commission that the BMJ launched in 2024, but it's an interesting start of some work that is being done globally to really look at academic medicine. And Cameron Abbasi is the editor of the BMJ. He's an incredibly thoughtful, bright individual, and he's really, I think, doing some interesting work in this area, trying to stimulate us around the world to think about the future of academic medicine. And one of the pieces in this is that mentorship does play a role in academic medicine. One of the, I started off the presentation saying, why I have the best job in the world. I truly, truly believe I have the best job because I get to see patients, I get to do research. The patients are the source of the questions that I get to ask. I get to interact with amazing learners who stimulate my interest, who challenge me all the time, and keep me interested every day. And there's not very many professions around the world where we have this opportunity to do so many different things and to have an impact on people's lives. And so I think that for us, it's really to think about how do we make sure that we sustain interest in academic medicine, and what are the opportunities for the future as well to continue to see it grow and accelerate. And so if people haven't seen this series, I wanted to make sure that you had a look at it, and in particular thinking about the importance that mentorship plays in academic medicine. So if we think about, does it actually happen? So does mentorship happen? So looking at the literature, less than 20% of faculty members in academic medicine were reported to have a mentor. And in the literature, there's a perception that women might have more difficulty finding a mentor than men, and that, again, slower promotion, less career satisfaction. And also, Karen Burns and Rena Patani led us on a project looking at our Department of Medicine data at U of T, showing that women academic physicians who were underrepresented minorities had lower career satisfaction than men. And in particular, the role of mentorship in this. And so we use data like this to really drive our mentorship program in our Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. And so I think, again, it highlights the importance of having the data to drive the changes that we want to see. So thinking about, how do we establish a mentorship program? And I thought I'd highlight kind of what we did. So, so my entire research career goes down to this one slide. So everything I do kind of focuses on this one slide. So this is the knowledge to action cycle. It's a theory of how we change behavior. And it's based on a review of theories of planned behavior. And in the middle is the knowledge cycle. So it's the primary research that we do, but then as you all know, then we like to do systematic reviews where we look at the totality of the evidence on a particular topic. We may use that then to create a guideline, or, if we're focusing on patients, we might do a decision aid. But the outside circle then is, how do we deliberately change behavior? So how do we implement that research evidence? And so we use this model to develop our mentorship program. And in particular, thinking about things from, we had knowledge of our gap, but then how do we then address that gap? So thinking about barriers. So some of the barriers are, who should be a mentor? How do we find them? How do we build capacity for mentors and mentees? And this is one of the things that we did within our department to really try and tackle the challenges that we identified in our gap analysis, and in particular, being able to support the development of the mentors, as well as supporting the development of the mentees. So what should they expect from the relationship when they have mentors? One of the things then that we looked at as well was, how should the relationship be structured? So a lot of times in the literature, they talk about a dyad model where there's a single mentee and a mentor, but often you might require more than one mentor. And so you might have a team approach, but it's really important, if there's a team, that there's good communication across, so that there's transparency, so that people know what the other mentors are saying. And so that it's not up to the mentee sometimes to kind of navigate communication challenges across the mentorship team. You can have mentors at a distance. So, people often worry about when they're setting up a mentorship program, well, do we have to make sure that everybody's mentor is in the University of Toronto? Well, no, you don't. You can have a mentor anywhere. And it's really down to the relationship that you're trying to build and whether there's a match. You should match based on characteristics such as race or gender or it's really comes down to the needs of the mentee. And I think this is why one of the things that we've tried to do is we spend time with the mentees to understand their needs before we identify potential mentors for them. There's also literature on, the longitudinal mentorship relationship versus micro mentoring, where you might, see somebody for 5 or 10 minutes every now and then. I think one of the things, again, as a mentee to think about is, what's useful. And I find the longitudinal approach is really helpful for people when they're setting up their careers, when they're launching, to really help them develop their strategy and their vision and their goals. And then to have those regular interactions and check-ins to make sure that they feel supported as they develop that career. I also wanted to highlight some work that's been done around mentorship for Indigenous faculty in health sciences. And if people haven't seen this paper, it's a really nice paper that focuses on the tailored approach that we should consider, and in particular thinking about co-creating the model for mentorship with Indigenous faculty. And so it's really thinking about, again, down to the individual mentees, what is needed and how best to meet their needs from a personal and relational and career perspectives. So we also thought about, like, one of the barriers, as I mentioned at the beginning, was around, how do we build capacity? And so one of the things that we did was really focusing on expectations for the mentors and the mentees around what the relationship is, the skills, the access to professional networks. So spent a lot of time really focusing on that, but also identifying, making sure that both mentees and mentors had a shared understanding of what mentorship is. And going back to that definition that I provided at the very beginning, that mentorship is really focused on, that totality of the relationship and the person's development, both career and also from often a personal perspective as well. So making sure that people start with that foundation of this is what you should expect in the relationship. And then in terms of finding a mentor, as I mentioned, one of the key themes is really recognizing who doesn't have a mentor, but offering opportunities to facilitate finding a mentor. It's great if somebody just, by chance happens to identify, a great mentor. Like I said, I found my first mentor when I'd finished my clinical training and was doing my research training. And it was just by chance. I'd never met him before, and it could have gone horribly wrong, right? So, you can move to a different country and, be working with somebody, and it could just, totally derail. But I was really fortunate that, it ended up that, he was a fantastic individual who really believed in mentorship. One of the things, though, is that not everybody, has that opportunity or is able to, able to find that. And so I think that, again, we as, me, for example, as a more senior faculty member, should be able to facilitate that for others and create those opportunities. And so one of the things that we did in our department was set up mentorship facilitators within each of our divisions, so that they would meet with everybody and identify their needs, but then work through trying to identify potential mentors and then facilitate those connections. And then it's up to the mentees then to meet with those mentors and, to find out, is this somebody that they want to have a mentoring relationship with? But they should also interview, and I always encourage people to interview the mentees of the mentor as well, to find out, are there any, things that they should be aware of. If I'm considering taking on a new mentee, I always tell them to talk with my other mentees, in confidence, and find out if there's things that, that I do that, potentially might drive them, really, drive them a little bit off the rails, and might irritate them. And so I think it's important for them to have that up front. We also do things like creating networking events, and this is in particular when we have national meetings and things, because if you're coming, like some of my mentees come from maybe smaller centers where they maybe don't have access to the breadth of mentorship that we might have at the University of Toronto. And so then if we do these national meetings and things, or international meetings, they're an opportunity for people to network. And often what we do is set up what we call speed mentoring sessions. And it's not to say that you can get mentorship in, 15 minutes, but the idea is to at least establish that connection in person. And then you can decide, is this somebody I want to have another chat with, and then explore a mentoring relationship. So those types of networking events can be incredibly helpful in terms of finding mentors. And then we looked at what makes an effective mentor and mentee. And not surprisingly, the literature shows that the mentee should be in the driver's seat, that they should be the ones organizing the meetings and saying, this is kind of my priorities for discussion. And then the mentors can have input into that as well. And the mentee should be, respectful and organized and committed to the relationship. And what about the mentors? Well, when we looked at this literature, we broke it down into the personal, the relational, and the professional characteristics. From a personal perspective, you want the mentor to be, that altruistic, understanding, non-judgmental person, but who motivates the mentee, who's an active listener, asks the right questions, and make sure that they continue to check in with the mentee. It's also making sure that, as mentors, we understand, what are the biases that we might be bringing to the relationship, and for the mentees to do the same thing, because we've all got different lived experiences that, that we're bringing into the relationship. And so it's important for us to reflect on that and think about, my experiences as a white woman, are going to be very different from experiences of a Black woman academic. So making sure that we understand, what our lived experience is, and how that might lead us to having blind spots, for example, when we're interacting with either mentees or mentors. From a relational perspective, it's also thinking about, we often talk about that compatibility between the mentors and the mentees, so that you feel like you can have that open, honest conversation. And ultimately, you want somebody who's knowledgeable and experienced, and who's going to be able to provide those opportunities for the mentee. So this is actually one of the first projects I did as a research fellow in Oxford, where at that time, I always say it was when the Earth was still cooling, so we did not have computers on the wards at that time. And so the project that I was interested in was, can we bring evidence to the point of care, and will it influence decision making? And so this is how I did it, building an evidence cart. And you can see there's a computer on it. We had a laptop computer, we had a little projector, and the screen was a portable screen that you could. It was actually tiny, that you could take around, and took this on rounds. And every time we had a question on rounds, we would use we would search for the evidence using the laptop. And you can look at this and you can say, like, Dave could have said, this is like the stupidest idea ever. Why would you do that? And he never did. He always prompted with questions, always talking about, have you thought about this? What about that? And so this was a great example of how you want somebody as a mentor who's going to be that active listener, that motivator, but is not going to crush your dreams. So the end of this story was, it was an effective study. It was my first JAMA publication, and within 6 months we had a wireless network in the hospital with tablet computers, and we had evidence linked to lab tests. It also showed how fast technology has developed. But what about the effective mentors' actions? Like, what should they actually do? I mentioned before that ideally you want somebody who's going to, really help with the vision building, who's going to help you identify as a mentee, where are those opportunities for me to develop skills, or, or increase my knowledge in a certain area? How do I navigate the bureaucracy within an institution? How do I navigate the politics within an institution? And how do I create my own networks of collaboration and things? So there's a lot of different personal actions that an effective mentor should do. And one of the things as well is, sometimes people say this protection and advocacy seems almost parental, and ideally a mentor should have your back. An excellent mentor should be that person who is going to support you, protect you, and advocate for you. They should be secure enough in their career that they can do that. And I think that, to me, is one of the fundamental things of an effective mentor. So this is an example of being a good sponsor. So the trainees in the room are going to be way too young to know who this guy is. So this is John Glenn, who was one of the first Mercury astronauts. And when I was a fellow in the UK, one day the first year that I was there, Dave and I had to share an office because it was a very tight space. So we shared an office. One day his phone rang, and he handed me the phone and he said, "NASA's calling for you." And, as a geriatrician who does clinappy research, you don't usually expect to have a phone call like that. And but the really great thing about Dave was he was an incredible sponsor. And so one of the interesting things was, John Glenn was one of the first astronauts, but then he became a senator in the US, and he wanted to go up into space again when he was over the age of 65. And so NASA wanted to know, what's the risk of sending a 65-year-old man into space again? What are the risks and from the individual perspective, and obviously from a NASA perspective. And so they had called Dave, and he handed me the phone and said, "Talk to them." And it wasn't that he said I should do it, and we talked about it afterwards, and he said, "I would never tell you what to do or what not to do, but think about it." And this was a great example of sponsorship, but also making sure that I had the choice. I had the choice of whether or not to do it. But again, it was this really interesting opportunity. And so finish the story, I did it. He went up to space. He was fine. And it led, though, to a couple of other projects with NASA, including looking at building decompression chambers and things on the International Space Station. So you never know kind of how these opportunities are going to evolve, but a good mentor will be able to facilitate those kinds of things. And then thinking about the relationship itself, I talked about making sure that we think about, that quality of the relationship, and thinking about having that open, honest communication. Also, the importance of, if you happen to be doing, similar research or education work in the same field as your mentor or your mentee, that you clarify the expectations around IP from the beginning. And there was a nice paper that came out in 2019 that talked about, again, a way of mentorship for us to really think about the reciprocity and using an equity lens. And again, this goes back to the mutual respect that has to embed the relationship, and us being mindful of our different lived experiences, our different biases that we might bring to the relationship. So this is Dave, and just to highlight, this is one of the things, again, around mentorship, is that It's also about making sure that you don't forget, the other aspects of life. So it's not just about your career. It's not just about, your clinical work and your research and your education and your quality improvement work, but it's about work-life integration. And a good mentor should also illustrate that. And we used to go on field trips, and this is one of the field trips where we learned how to drive a steam train. And so just to highlight that, you want to make sure that you bring that to the relationship as well. So looking at our Department of Medicine, then I'll just spend the last few minutes just talking about kind of how we developed the mentorship program, and in particular using the data to drive change, as I mentioned. And so every couple of years we do surveys in our U of T Department of Medicine, and looking at how do we need to tailor our mentorship program to continue to refine it over time. And some of the areas that we identified over time, for example, was that we were really good at identifying mentorship needs when people were initially launching their careers, so at the early career stage. But then we really had a gap as people were transitioning to mid-career and senior, and so really wanting to make sure that we had mentorship across the career trajectories. And so that was something that we used then to drive change as well. And so it's about on an ongoing basis, making sure we monitor that and adjust our programs so that we really do respond to the needs. We also did, in addition to the quantitative, we do qualitative work every on the alternate years to explore this in more detail. And again, it highlighted some of the things with regards to gender equity that we needed to consider, and also thinking about aspects of the career stage that I mentioned as well. And one of the things that we identified was, there might be groups within the department who have insufficient access to those informal networks where mentors may be identified. And so wanting to make sure that then we would facilitate access. And this is why we created things like I mentioned around the mentorship facilitator program, and making sure that we were really clear that here's somebody within each of the divisions that you can reach out to try and facilitate access. We also wanted to make sure that we addressed the advocacy and support for mentors. And in addition to expanding it across the career trajectory, we also wanted to embed awards and recognition in their promotion for good mentors. So really wanting to make sure that we highlighted that as well as part of our mentorship program. And you can see in this that the mentorship program was part of a larger body of work that we did as well, and really trying to promote a culture change within the department as well. So we really focused on the facilitation of mentorship, but providing then as well adequate resources for career development. The informal network events that I talked about, we looked at compensation models and making sure that that people were appropriately compensated, depending on their different job categories and things. So really looking at all of those different aspects. And as I mentioned, we created a lot of different resources. So the mentorship facilitator, we have mentorship workshops. When we recruit anybody into the department as part of their academic planning document, the mentor reviews it with them and has to sign off on it with them. It could be more than one mentor, but they have to sign off on it, and then on an ongoing basis check in with them. And then we also have different resources that we've created, and in particular, if anybody's interested, these are on our Department of Medicine website. They include everything from a checklist to an individual development plan for mentees and mentors to use, different mentorship cases and top tips. And a lot of these came out of the book that we wrote. And this is the book. This is kind of the last substantive project I did with Dave before he died. And when we talked about it, we talked about the cover of the book. We wanted a senior woman mentoring a more junior man, and Dave and I had, he was very much in favor of having that on the cover. And it was funny because a few years after I guess actually about 2 years after the book came out, it got translated into Korean. And normally we don't know when our books get translated until all of a sudden they show up on our desk. And this is the cover of the Korean edition, and you can see that it's not just the language that was different, but the cover was a little bit different as well. So and by that time it was funny because I often thought about it. Dave unfortunately died before the Korean edition came out, but I think he would have been horrified. So, and finally, I just wanted to thank my mentees. I started at the beginning saying I have the best job in the world, and they are the reason, in addition to the patients that I get to see, it's the mentees who make my job the best in the world. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to come in and chat with you today, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. Anybody who has any questions, please pop them into the chat. I thought that was an incredible talk, and certainly the Department of Medicine mentorship program has really helped inform and in us developing our Department of Ophthalmology mentorship program, which is a new initiative, and really thank you very much for all you've done for the Faculty of Medicine as well, because that really helped us to decide what to do with our program. Are there any questions? If not, I have some. I was curious to know, I know you said that less than 20% of the literature showed less than 20% of people have mentorship in academic medicine, or at least previously. Why do you think that number is so low? I think even obviously without looking at the literature, I think we can generally think there are some benefits to mentorship. Why do you think that number is so low?
Yeah, I think it's multifactorial. I think that one of them is lack of recognition of the importance of mentorship. One is lack of access to mentorship. And we found as well that within certain job descriptions, like we found clinician scientists were more likely to have mentors than clinician teachers. And we saw that in like our department, but we also saw it in the literature as well. And I think part of it is, if you're a clinician scientist, you've kind of come up in the model of you've got a supervisor for your graduate training and things like that, and you might have been exposed more to mentorship, whereas a clinician teacher might not have had that same opportunity for exposure. And so we found that in both the literature review that we did, as well as our own survey and qualitative work that we did in our department. So I think that's a factor as well. And then also, we talked about access in terms of if people might think I want a mentor, but how do I actually find one? And so I think the more mentorship programs like what you've developed, I think it's going to lead to more awareness, better access, and making sure that that it works for people. Because I think that's the other thing too is, we don't want to just assign people, a mentor and think it's all going to work. We really want to make sure that the relationship is one that is effective, that people feel comfortable, that they feel it's a safe space they can have those conversations in. And I think that's kind of building that awareness of what mentorship is and can be, and setting the expectations that, I always say everybody should have mentorship.
Mm. And I see that, there's several residents in the audience, and I wanted to get a sense for, obviously there's faculty mentorship, but and mentorship from faculty to learner. What about mentorship from learner to learner, like junior to senior resident, or, even where they're not spread across that broadly? Do you think that there's an important aspect to that for our learners?
For sure. And
Peer mentorship.
yeah, no, for sure. We often talk about, everybody can provide mentorship. And, so I think that, as a resident, you can provide mentorship to more junior residents or to medical students. And so I think I think definitely that's an opportunity. There's also literature around peer mentorship. So, if there's, I know when I was in Calgary, that we did some work on peer mentorship with the residents. And I think there are different things that you get out of peer mentorship as opposed to mentorship from a senior individual. So I talked in the presentation about a senior person is going to be able to provide those sponsorship opportunities. So being able to, provide you with networking opportunities and collaborations and introductions, giving you a chance to participate on a grant maybe that you never had before that your peers aren't going to be able to do. So I think it's also about thinking what, what are the gaps? Like, what do you need? And, and then the peer mentorship is gonna meet some needs. And then the senior mentorship is gonna meet other needs. And so I think it's really important to recognize those differences, and what you can expect from each.
So do you think that people should have, is there like an average number of mentors that you found people had in the research, or at, because it sounds like you need different mentors potentially for different things.
Well, I think it's, I often say, like, if you can find a single mentor who can, can provide you with that totality of things that you need, that's great. Sometimes you can't, and so then you might need more, you might need more than one. And I always tell the story of one of my mentees who had a team of 5, and I have permission from her to share this story. And I always tease her that she goes for best 3 out of 5. So it's whatever, and I think that one of the things that we do have to make sure is that, if there are those 5 people on the mentorship team, if we're all telling different things, if we're all saying, have you thought about this opportunity? Have you thought about that opportunity? It can become overwhelming for the mentee. And so that's why I think as well, it's important that there's communication across a mentorship team, so that, we're not all kind of bombarding, the mentee with, different opportunities, and, you should collaborate here, or you should apply for this grant or whatever, take on this teaching opportunity. So I think we just have to be mindful of that, and make sure that there is, transparency, across the mentorship team.
Sharon, one of the questions I have is, it seems like there's 2 different types of mentorship. There's a formal mentorship where you're a mentor for a particular person, and then there may be informal mentorships where, what you're saying about horizontally, peer to peer, that's a friendship,
Mhm.
right? How do you see that developing? Like, do we need both in place? And then the other question I have, part 2, is that um, should a mentor have similar problems or issues that the mentee has? For example, people of color, uh, indigenous people, gender. Um, what's your opinion about that?
Yeah. So with regards to I'll do the second question first. With regards to that one, the literature says it depends. And so it comes down to the needs of the individual mentee and what would they find most helpful. And, like if I have mentees who are BIPOC individuals, for example, I always encourage them to think about, again, maybe, me plus somebody else who's got, a more similar lived experience to them. And, if that's going to meet their needs. So I think it's about making sure we have that conversation with the mentee and saying, this is what I can provide. This is what I can't provide. Like, I remember the very first time, as I said, when I met Dave, he said to me, this is what I can do. This is what I can't do. Like, and one of the things he said to me was, he was a white man, and, Barbara, his wife, looked after their 4 kids. And he said, like, without that, he wouldn't have the career that he had. And he said to me, but I know you're going to have you have a different experience. You have a different lived experience. And he said, so I'm going to have blind spots there. And so because of that, he said, I can introduce you to others who maybe don't have the same blind spots as me. So I think it's about that, and recognizing what the mentees might need, and for the mentors to actually be honest about that. With regards to the peer-to-peer, and I like that you use the term friendship, because I think that's one of the things that we always have to be mindful of as like I always say the things to be careful of when there's a mentee and a mentor relationship. One is the mentor is not the therapist. And, you know, and making sure that we're, you know, we're very clear around what we can and can't do. And then also when the relationship evolves to the point, like one of my one of my very first mentees, you know, I started off my very first year on staff, and she was a fellow. She was at UCSF at the time, and you know, over the years, you know, she became one of my best friends. And I said, we're no longer like, it's no longer mentor and mentee, right? And I said, when I became the godmother to her child, you're no longer mentor and mentee, you know, your peers and your friends. And it's recognizing that. And the relationship is very different. And that's okay. Like, that's an evolution of that relationship. But I think it's also important to recognize that, and making sure that that's very clear. Um, and like, those peer-to-peer relationships are very important. You know, and what are the experiences that you know, that we have that bring to that. But no matter what, and no matter what our stage in our career, I think it's really important that we still, you know, think about access to mentorship. And you know, I remember when I was talking to one of the new deans of medicine at one of the new medical schools, and at West, and he said to me, one of the first things he wanted to do was find a mentor, because he said, you know, this is a different stage in his career, you know, and he, you know, and he really, you know, wanted to find a mentor. And I thought, like, that underscored to me, like, no matter what stage of your career that you're at, and it's important to have that mentorship. And we can't just have our peer relationships in that. Like, that's an important, you know, very fulfilling part of our life, but we also have to, you know, attend to the other aspects, and making sure that we think about mentorship at all career stages.
So does mentorship end when friendship begins? Like, when, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important question, because you know, because I said, like, you know, we can be like, I'll use Jana as an example, because I think once you become really close friends like that, you do develop blind spots, right? And so yes, you know, you can be objective, and you try and be objective, and things, and you want to, you know, still be a great mentor. But I think, you know, it also is it's a very different relationship. And so I think that we have to be mindful of that. So, you know, I always say that, you know, when we become really good friends like that, yes, we can become peer mentors, and, you know, but I'm not going to be the senior mentor anymore. And same thing, like, the other piece that we didn't really talk about, that it brings to mind as well, is once, like, as a mentor, like, when I first became chief of medicine in the Department of Medicine at St. Mike's, I had some mentees in the Department of Medicine and at St. Mike's, and I said, I can't be your mentor anymore, because all of a sudden, when you're in this role where you control resources, you know, I said, like, it's not fair to them, because the perception, and it's not fair to others in the department, because of the perception that, oh, I might be, you know, favoring one person over another, you know, that perception. And so so I think that's also a piece that we have to consider as well, that, you know, we as the mentors, you know, if they take on like a leadership role, and there's that potential for you know, that really a massive power imbalance in some cases. Like, I've seen it, you know, so it could be somebody, you know, in a very senior position in the university, for example. You know, I think we have to be very, very cautious around the mentor-mentee relationship, for the sake of the mentee, as well as others, and, you know, in whether it's in the faculty, the department, or whatever.
I found that was interesting what you said about late career men being one of the groups that had less mentorship, and the importance at that stage, like what you're commenting on, because we typically perceive that's the group that has the most power in academic medicine, people who are senior career stage men, but yet there's still an importance for mentorship, and that was perhaps a group that we overlook, thinking that they're past that stage of needing it. So I think that's a really important learning point for us as well, to really look at mentorship across all stages of career.
Well, the other, and so it's a great point and that you've raised, and in particular, because one of the things that we found is, as people are transitioning to towards retirement, for example, like that was kind of one of the areas
Mm.
that we identified is, how do we mentor people, as they're moving in that stage and wanting to be able to provide that. The other piece as well is across the career trajectories is, again, one of the great things about being an academic, I think, is that we can change our careers, right? Like we can kind of do different things. It's again, how many professions in the world can you go off into so many different directions and, start working at journals or, take on university academic jobs or hospital academic jobs or OMA or whatever, like, or Health Canada, FAC, like we have so many different career opportunities. And I think part of that too is making sure that that the mentorship might change over time to reflect that as well. Because you will have different needs. And I think a lot of times, we think about the early career stage, and that's incredibly important to make sure that people are positioned for success. But we also know as people go mid-career and senior, that their careers, often do change. And we want to make sure that they are getting mentorship through those changes as well and getting supported.
So for our residents or junior faculty, certainly we're trying to create mentorship programs, but do you think that there's a benefit to, in a sense, cold emailing somebody you think you might resonate with? It sounds like that's a little bit of what happened with your story at Oxford, which sounds like really changed the trajectory in a way of your academic career with your relationship with Dr. Sackett. Is there a benefit to, how should our residents potentially go and try and connect with somebody they think would be a good mentor?
Yeah, no, I think, I always say, like, if you feel comfortable doing it, but I think that's again the thing is that, not everybody feels that, that comfort in being able to reach out. And, I always tell people, like, what's the worst that could happen? If you send them an email to somebody, what's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen is that they say no, they ignore you. Well, I can live with that. So, but I think we should, if there is somebody, go for it. But I also realize that not everybody, feels comfortable doing that. And so then that's where we can help facilitate those introductions. And, and I would always encourage people to say, like if there is somebody that they want to, potentially work with, if I know that individual, or even if I don't, that I can be the one to, to email and see if they're interested. And it's not, and again, one of the things I always say is don't, I would encourage them to, email and say, do you have time to chat? I'd like to learn more about your career. Um, and then use that initial chat as an opportunity to kind of explore further. Because I think that's sets kind of a nice stage that you're just doing that exploratory initial kind of meeting and then going from there.
My final question for you, you have about 25 plus mentees. How do you have time for it all?
Well, I think some of them uh they're at different stages, and some of them are, like, as I said, like one of the people on the list that I talked about is one of the people who's become a great friend. So she was a mentee, but now she's a great friend. And so but I learned from her along the way, and I think that's kind of one of the key things. These are people who are or were my mentees, and I learned from them, and that's why I acknowledge them, because to me that was a gift, and why I feel privileged to do what I get to do every single day, because they're incredible individuals, and it's been a privilege to learn from them.
Well, thank you. I think that is a lovely note on which to end. And I sincerely, our whole department appreciates your time and sharing your expertise and your wisdom and your journey. And I hope that we can continue to draw on you as a resource as we develop our mentorship program. I have put two links in the chat. One is our faculty to faculty mentorship program, and Dr. Angela Zhang is our director of mentorship who is helping to create this program. So if you'd like to participate, please email our dovs.facultyaffairs@utoronto.ca, and also at the COS, that's our, Dr. Strauss, that's our Canadian Ophthalmological Society. We've created an equity-focused mentorship program for medical students of underrepresented groups, and you do not have to identify as being from an equity minority deserving group yourself to be a mentor. Anyone can be a mentor. And as we talked about here, there's benefit to concordance and also having mentors from identities of power. So please sign up for that as well if you have interest in mentoring medical students. So on that note, everybody, thank you very much for joining this morning. Special thank you to Dr. Strauss for her wonderful talk today. Please fill out the feedback link to get your CME credits. And thank you very much and have a lovely morning.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.